Texas Panhandle, late summer. A sky like hammered tin presses on the Llano Estacado. Heat shimmer turns distance into water that isn't there. A broken freight wagon lies canted in a salt-white arroyo. One wheel spun clear, spokes like ribs. Vultures corkscrew higher as dry lightning crawls above the red bluffs. A dust devil unspools, flinging sand like needles that sting skin and eyes. Honor Quinn, a widowed schoolteacher labeled too fierce to love by her own town after she defied a ranch heir, has been shackled to the wagon tongue as escort riders vanish with her dowry and papers. Hunted by both a sheriff's posse and hired cutthroats who'd rather deliver a corpse, she hears hoofbeats approaching at dusk and braces for the worst with nothing but a broken file tucked in her bodice and a will that won't break. The rider who slid down the ridge at last light was no savior. Comanche paint on his face, hawk bells chiming at his wrist, and the knife he raised in the wind was meant for chains. This tale survives in 3 scraps: a sheriff's deposition with one name scratched out, an undertaker's ledger charging 2 iron bracelets removed, cash only, and a mission register where a signature was cut from the page with a penknife. Next, you will see why that single missing name and that cut changed everything. Honor ran with wrists burning and lungs raw and feet slipping in powder. The man with the paint and the bells kept his horse between her and the open ridge where the shooters had been. A second rider appeared on the height beyond, young and narrow and keen-eyed, face set. He rode to cut their flank and then dropped the horse to a safe slide, stones clattering. The first rider signed with his hand again. Down, shade, now. They slid into the mouth of a side wash where the sun did not reach at that hour, and the air there felt like a mercy, even heat that did not bite so hard. Behind them, near the broke wagon, something glinted under a sheet of blown sand. Honor saw it with the part of her mind that saw everything, even when her life was running. It looked like iron shaped into a letter. It looked like fire had kissed it lately. She swallowed and tasted iron already in her mouth. She ran all the same. In the low place between 2 shelves of caliche, they stopped and listened. The only sound was the horse's breath and the dry scrape of a lizard. The older man crouched and picked a speck of red earth from the groove of the knife, cleaned it on his trousers without haste, and slid the blade home. He had patience that made the world slow down around him. The young one kept watch with a hungry sharpness that would have made him careless if the other had not been there. They were Comanche. Honor had seen Comanche riders from far, like drops of ink that moved across the horizon and turned cowhands to whispers. She had taught boys who bragged they would prove themselves reckless and brave against such men, and watched those boys become men who learned to keep their heads down and their stock close and their words quiet. She stood, unchained, and did not run from the men before her. She took breath. She steadied. The older one spoke first, but his words were spare, and he made his hands speak with them. "Sata," he said, tapping his chest. He touched the young man's shoulder and said a second name, Pahi. He pointed at Honor and lifted his eyebrows. Not unkind, not soft. She said her name and made the shape of it with her hands, the way she did with little ones who learned with eyes as much as ears. The corner of his mouth moved, not a smile, not a frown. He lifted his palm and drew a straight line across it with 2 fingers, and then touched the same straight line to the inside of her wrist, where the iron had burned. The movement said something like rule, or code, or debt. He pointed toward the open wash where the wagon lay broken, and the sun hammered the ground until the dirt itself smelled scorched. He shook his head once. Not safe. Move. A shot came from far off, and then another, thin as the sound of a nail tapped into board a house away. They were not alone in the bluffs. Honor's legs shook and held. Sate signed again. She went where his hand said. The young one, Pahi, took the rear and looked back often and grinned once with all his teeth at whatever he saw when the shadows moved near the rim. The grin did not reach his eyes either, but not because he was cruel, because he was alive, and he knew it, and liked to test the line where life and death sat down together. They reached the lip of a canyon mouth where the air changed from oven to kiln to something like a cellar in a church. The world dropped away in red step after red step. A hawk cut a bright arc below them like a thrown blade, and then rose on another column of heated air, small as a hand, then a thorn, then gone. Sate led his horse along a path that had been used so long, feet had turned stone to dust. Honor followed, one hand to the warm neck of the horse for balance. Her knees argued. Her breath was a hard cloth in her throat. She did not fall. Down where the floor of the canyon turned from baked powder to packed sand, there was shade under a cliff fold and a tiny breath of water that showed its presence only by the freshness of a clump of grass where green should not have been. Sate knelt there and scooped dark wet and pressed it into his own mouth and did not speak. He held out his hand toward Honor. The motion was without question or favor. It said simply, "Drink, because you have to live first if you plan to do anything after that." She put her hand under his hand and caught what water he let go. It was not much. It was everything for that moment. When her heart slowed, the tremble in her hands did not. She looked down and saw her wrists where the iron had kissed and flayed a thin line. The old skin would heal hard and ropey. The new skin would be tender a long time. She did not hide the marks. She turned her arm over and back. She set the picture of it in her mind and did not look away from her own history, not even as it was being written. Sate rose and took from his saddle a painted shield that had seen daylight and moonlight both. The hide worn smooth where hands took hold. He rested it against the rock. He unfastened a parfleche, folded like a book, and showed her nothing in it, only that he had one, and folded it again. He took up a small bundle, wrapped in dull cloth, and tied with sinew. He did not open that either. He set his hand on it, like a man sets his hand on a Bible, before he swears. Then he looked at her, and she knew, without understanding the words, that he had rules older than the law that wore a badge. He said, slowly now, each word like a measured bead on a string, that he would not kill a woman or a child, and he would not kill a prisoner, and he would not leave an enemy able to lie. He touched his chest with a flat palm as he said this. Then he touched the line on her wrist. He said, "Debts are not forgotten." He said, "Lies are." Honor stood straight. She said, "Men in town wished her dead, and wished it quiet, and wished it be said that she could not handle the world as it was." She did not say Silas's name. It was a piece she was not ready to lay on the table. She said she had been called fierce when she kept her voice even, and prideful when she kept her head high, and stubborn when she refused to nod when a thing was wrong. She said none of that made her a liar. The sun reached further into the canyon and leaped off the shield and made a bright coin on the rock. Sate did not blink. Up beyond the canyon, on a cottonwood flat, where the wind had a little mercy, Sheriff Tom Ellison met Silas Rook under the shade, like two men who had a right to meet in public, and did not. Ellison's face was the color of boiled rope from a life in sun. Silas's face was smooth as paper. He passed a money roll from one hand to the other, as if he were adjusting a cuff. "Bring me the paper the priest signed," Silas said, and turned his head, as if the matter tasted sour. "That signature binds her to me." Ellison did not take the money. He did not look at it either. He looked at the prairie grass moving in a shiver that meant heat and no wind at all, then looked down at his boots and said, "The priest's book had a cut in it where a name should be." Silas's smile did not change, but the muscles of his jaw worked twice, and then settled. "Then you bring me the book," he said, "or you bring me the girl." Ellison picked up the hat he had let hang by the stampede string and said nothing. He was a decent man who had let one bad compromise breed others like mice. Padre Santiago Valdez opened the parish register in the little room behind the chapel, where light came in green through bottle-glass panes. The book smelled like dust that had once been wet, and like the oil he rubbed into leather when he wanted it to last. He turned pages with 2 fingers like a man changing the bandage on a wound. The entry he came to had Honor's name in a tidy hand, and a space where a name should be that had been cut out with a sharp blade. The cut was clean as a rule. He set the pad of his thumb on the edge and felt the way the paper lifted a little, where fibers lay exposed. He felt watched, though the room was empty. He crossed himself because it was the habit of his hands, not because he thought it would change anything. Then he shut the book and folded his hands tight until his knuckles felt like stones in a sack. Down in the canyon, the air went from heat to something that thought about being cool and did not quite manage it. A breeze went through and laid dust down, and then took it up again, just to prove it could. Pahi, the young one, prowled the line of shadow like a cat who has not yet learned old patience. He listened to the rock and the wind, and the silence under that. He did not like the silence. Satay moved the horse to higher ground and rubbed at a small knot in its shoulder that had come up from the hard slide. The animal leaned into the pressure and sighed. Honor took the moment to find the little file in her dress again and work at the last unbroken link where the shackle had not fully parted. She felt the rough tooth cut and cut. A bright fleck of iron nicked her thumb, and she put it in her mouth without thinking and tasted her own blood, salt and old iron, and a little grit, and the taste sent a flare of heat to her eyes that was not from the day. They stayed until the angle of light told Satay what he needed to know about who would be moving on the rim. Then he made a shape with his hand that meant follow, and they went deeper into the cut, where taller walls of red let them walk without being seen from above. Honor learned to step where Satay stepped, and to do it without making loose stone run. She learned the way he looked at the land as a page full of words most people could not read. He paused where a ring of grass lay dead, a perfect circle where lightning had kissed not long ago. He looked up then and watched a hawk make one small loop and then another above a far rim. He watched a coyote cross a dry run upstream, not down. He made a small motion that meant patience, and they waited long enough that Honor could feel the heat come off the wall and move past her like a slow breath. It was the kind of waiting that could turn into safety or into ambush. Her nerves jittered and then slowly settled in a way that felt like a held note finally allowed to end. At the trading post on the Belknap Road, a man with ink on his fingers wrote down in a crabbed hand, 2 sets iron manacles, escort fee, brand file. He wiped his pen and left a smear anyway. He did not look up when the buyer counted out coins. He did not ask why a ranch heir would need irons when cattle could be tied with rope. The book was not his conscience. He was only supposed to make the marks. Straight, toward evening, clouds that had only been decoration all day became act and actor. They swelled and went the color of meat and old bruise. Wind hit the canyon in a single slap and then held like a hand on a throat. Satay tilted his head and listened and looked to where a narrow cut entered the main channel, and all at once he was moving to it, fast. And so was Pahi, and so was Honor, because they were, and because the sound that came next was a growl under their feet that deepened until it became a roar. Water that had not been there a minute ago came down the side cut in a thick brown wall full of sticks and stones and dead grass and a piece of fence post and the body of a rabbit with its eyes wide open. It hit the place where they had been standing and rolled it flat like bread dough under a housewife's hands. The land had decided to talk with its full voice. Satay threw a coil of rawhide to a cottonwood and looped it twice, and then bit the line to set it. He shoved Honor toward it, with no time for gentle. She caught the rope with both hands and felt it burn as it took her weight. Pahi gathered the horse's head and forced it into the smooth spot in the lee of a boulder and spoke to it low with a word that sounded like stone on stone. The flood licked their boots and then climbed their thighs and tried for their waists. It was cold that felt like a shock from a sadist's hand, and it stank of old rot and iron soil and the memory of all the things that had died upstream. Honor wrapped the rope twice around her forearm and gritted her teeth as it bit and held, and she felt Satay's hands under hers at the same rope, backing her weight with his own. He hauled once, hard, and moved them all a step higher against the tree. The water complained and then accepted it, while the flood ate their tracks, and the spots where they had rested, and the small dry hollows that had held their prints like little cups. A thing the size of a shoe smacked against Honor's boot. She could not look down. She could feel the thing. Leather, flat, hard, with age, bump and press, and then stick where her heel made a pocket in the current. She made a small sound that in another life would have been a laugh, and in this one was only surprise, at one more detail, in a world that did not need more of them. Pahi saw it. He let go the horse with one hand and snagged the leather out of the churn and held it up. It was a packet tied with thong. The flap had a clerk's scratch, and water had made it soft at the edges, but the center was dry still. He shoved it into Honor's hands, because both of his were suddenly needed for the horse. The flood lost interest as quick as it had taken it. It fell a hand's breadth, and then another, muttering now, instead of shouting. The tree shivered and shed a little shower of red leaves that were not autumn, only shock. Sate worked the rope loose and rubbed the red line it had left on Honor's forearm. Not soft, just thorough, like a craftsman checking a tool he needed to trust. She opened the packet with fingers that shook and found inside a tally from the post on the Belknap Road. The writing was clean and ugly at once. 2 sets iron manacles, escort fee, brand file, paid in coin. The name signed at the bottom told the worst truth in a small, neat hand that had once written his own letters to her and signed them with flourishes that showed he thought writing was an art he owned. Honor did not say the name out loud. Her hand closed on the paper so tight she heard fibers complain. Sate looked at the tally the way a man looks at tracks that confirm what he already believed. He did not say anything either. He lifted his hand and drew a white line across his palm with a finger dipped in the clay that had settled at the flood's edge. He took the same clay with the same finger and drew a line across the inside of Honor's wrist where iron had drawn first. He did it as if the act itself could cut the iron memory and set a different mark over it, one made of earth, one that could be washed away or renewed at will, not forced with fire. He set his palm to hers, line to line, heat to heat, and pressed. When he drew back, the clay lines had printed each other. Until the debt is balanced, your life and mine are bound, the gesture said. The hawk bells gave one soft sound like agreement, up on the rim where a wind could catch a hat and take it 2 counties in a minute. Sheriff Ellison met the sky at the line where it kneels on the world and felt the places in his body where years sit. He had given the badge the best he knew how. He had let it cover things it should not. He had said yes to the first small wrong and watched how that wrong birthed other wrongs without asking him at all. He had taken money once to look away from a brand changed with a file. He had told himself it was only a letter or two. He had told himself men lost cattle and won them back every season, and who could count? The money had bought a new roof that kept his Sophia dry when the northers came. He pressed 2 fingers to the badge and wished it was heavy enough to drag him down into the dirt like a plowshare and plant him there. He turned his horse toward the mission, because sometimes a priest could take a guilt a sheriff could not carry alone, even if a priest put it back in your hands when you were done talking. Night dropped, as if someone had reached up and pinched the last of the light and pulled it out of the world. The canyon made its own dark separate from the sky. Stars came on in a scattered handful, and then more. Sate fed a small fire with sticks that had not seen water and made flame that did not speak loud. Pahi walked the perimeter and then walked it again. Honor sat with the packet and the tally and the broken file laid side by side like an altar she had not asked for. Her wrists hurt less and more now. The hurt had a place to go, and it went to the part of her that remembered what she had said to Silas the night she handed his ring back. She had said a strange thing then, learned from a girl in her school who had no English when she arrived, and put her hand to her chest and said her name once, and then put her hand to Honor's chest and said Honor's name twice, and then, later, lay her hand in Honor's hair when Honor bowed her head over a child's spelling book and fell asleep there as if she had been allowed to rest for the first time in a year. Honor had said to Silas, without knowing how to explain it, that love was not a thing you set irons on. He had laughed as if she had told a joke he could sell in town. In the night, something moved beyond the line of their camp. Not a man, not a big animal. It made a whisper like a skirt or light brush dragged by a child at play. It was the sound of a dozen small feet at once. Pahi turned his head slow so as not to spook his horse. He saw eyes like chips of moon. He saw nothing else. The coyotes crossed upstream, not down. Sate made a small mark in the dirt with a stick, a coyote's line with an extra notch. He nodded once. Honor did not understand all of it, but she understood that the world left messages if a person knew how to read them, and she understood that she had not known how to look until now. She let that new humility sit beside her anger and found the two did not fight as much as she thought they might. In town, under lamplight leached thin by cheap oil, Marjorie Quinn stood in the doorway between the parlor and the hall at Silas Rook's ranch house and listened to him tell three men how good men were misunderstood and how the world punished those who took on the burden of others, and how a woman like Honor could not be left to her own devices because her courage would skid into ruin without his hand to steady it. Marjorie watched her own hands, small and dry at the knuckles from too much laundry and too little fat in the pot, and saw how they shook. She had let herself be dazzled by the way Silas knew which fork to take at a table where there were more than two. She had let herself be told that Honor's fire burned everything it touched. She had wanted a life where someone looked at her and saw a jewel and not a stone. She had signed a thing once without reading it all the way, because Silas told her that was best and right and kept a family safe. She went to the little room that had been the housekeeper's before Agnes Wainwright's husband died and pulled Honor's trunk from under the bed where she had pushed it when Silas told her to wait. She could not lift it. She put her cheek to the leather and whispered a sorry, so soft it was only air moving. Agnes Wainwright dipped her pen and wrote in the undertaker's ledger in a hand that had no ornament at all. Removal. 2 iron bracelets. Cash only. Before sunrise. She did not write a name in the line where a name should go. Her hand shook once and then steadied. She had taken cash before to keep a man from a charge he did not deserve, and she had taken cash to keep a woman from the humiliation of a public cutting. She told herself that sometimes mercy wore a plain face and came at a price. She told herself something else with another part of her mind, that she had been asked not to say, and she had agreed not to say, and that her agreement made her part of the sin. She closed the ledger and set her hand flat over the page, as if she could feel the indent of the words through leather. She could not. Before dawn came, something with a broken rhythm entered the canyon at a sideways stumble. It was a horse without a rider. It came with its head low and its ears loose, and a saddle that had been ridden hard and wiped fast, but not well. There was a wound in its shoulder that had been packed with cloth, and the cloth was gray with blood and dirt. It looked like a story that had not finished yet and did not know how to end. Sate went to it slow and made himself smaller than he was, the way a man does when he wants a horse to believe he has no need to prove himself. Pahi took the bridle in 2 fingers, like it was a thread and not leather. Honor went to the saddlebags because Sate looked at them and then at her and made a small motion. She opened one and found money rolled fast and tight, and small bits of silver that had worked loose and fallen to the bottom of the bag and made a soft rain when she shook them. She opened the other and found paper crumpled and damp and signed at the bottom with a hand that had written warrants for 20 years. The words were for her arrest. The charges were words that could be made to mean anything if a man with a badge was willing. Her hands went cold. Her heart did a thing in her chest that felt like a fist opening and closing and finding no handle to grip. Pahi touched the horse's neck and then lifted the flap where the maker's stamp had worn smooth. He looked at Sata, and then at Honor, and then at the rim, and he smiled without mirth and with a little savage joy. He knew whose horse it had been. He knew that men who thought they were following a trail were sometimes being led. He knew that if a horse came home alone, it meant a rider's day had gone sideways. He did not say any of this. He pointed to the saddle horn, where the rawhide had burned a groove, the way a man turns a rope in panic when he means to pull a thing closer and finds it pulling him instead. The morning widened. The light came down the rock in slow fingers. Honor had not slept. Satay had slept the way a man sleeps who knows the land holds him, and not the other way around, a handful of minutes here and there put together into enough. Pahai had not slept, because he could not stop listening to the world breathe. The three of them sat with the money, the warrant, the tally, the broken file, the medicine bundle wrapped and tied, the painted shield, the horse that had come without its master, the sound of water somewhere under stone. The land pressed its hand to their backs and made them move. They climbed out by a path that a mule would have called foolish and a Comanche called practical. At the lip of the canyon, heat hit them like a wall again, but there was wind now, shifty and mean. In the distance, the red bluffs stacked like altars to a god that liked the taste of sweat. Satay pointed to a flat where mesquite made black claws against the sky. He drew a circle in the dust and drew 3 marks inside it, one for Honor, one for himself, one for Pahi. He drew 5 marks outside. He brushed 2 away with the side of his hand and left 3. He grunted. He did not need to say the men who had shot from the ridge would have friends. He did not need to say they would come with greed in their mouths and law in their pockets. Honor felt fear run its hard hand up her spine, and then felt something else meet it. The part of her that had been called fierce and made to think that was a shame. It was not a shame. It was a tool. She put her hand to her chest and felt the steady thud and told herself that she belonged to herself. They went toward the place where Satay's people sometimes made counsel when a choice had to be weighed. It was not a fixed camp. It was a habit of ground and a habit of gathering. The path there took them along the spine of a bluff that looked down on brush cut by game trails. It took them past a place where a lightning-struck pinon stood bare and silver, limbs like fingers pointing at anything but the sky. It took them along a bench where the bones of a long-ago bison lay half-buried and white as chalk, rib after rib, like a book left open. Pahi touched one and said a word that meant remember. Honor put her hand on the bone after him. It was smooth under dust, and it had held up weight and heat and winter and teeth, and it had done its job and been left, and still it was a kind of witness. They made a small camp under rock, with a view wide enough to see trouble coming in 3 directions. Satay sent Pahi to read sign on the 4th. He set the painted shield where a bullet would hit it first, if a man shot wild from the rim. He took the clay from the flood edge and remade the line on his palm, because it had worn off when he hauled on the rope. He looked to Honor and waited. She remade the line on her wrist and pressed her palm to his again. The clay printed itself on both hands and looked like a ritual from a church she had never walked into, and maybe it was. The hawk bells rang once on a stray gust and were still. Honor took the tally from the packet and folded it in half, then in half again, then slid it into the seam of her bodice where the broken file had lived. She put the warrant beside it. She looked at the money and at the horse that had carried it and at the way the day moved. She thought of Sheriff Ellison's face when he had stood on her porch with the paper he did not read aloud. She had known him since she was 12 and had taken pies to his wife when the pneumonia tried to take her and failed. She had watched him pick up a child in the street when a remount ran mad and put that child on a roof and take the kick in his own thigh that left him with a limp when the weather turned. She wanted to hate him and could not yet. She could hate what he had let himself become. She could hate the way a good man goes a step too far and then takes 2 more, because the first step must be justified. The wind freshened. It brought the smell of sweat and oiled leather and men who had not bathed in a day and thought that did not matter. Satay turned his face into it and closed his eyes as if he could see with his skin. He could. He signed to Honor to stay low and to move when he moved. He took the horse's lead and let it fall to the length that gave the animal its head. He put the painted shield across his back like a turtle wears a home. Pahi appeared at the far edge of the rock, lips tight. He flared his nostrils in a sign that meant many, and not far. They went down the lee side of the bluff where Juniper made a screen and found a narrow run that would hide them for a minute, and no more. They crossed it quick. Honor's foot slipped once, and she took a small stone into her palm that cut a line short and bright. She closed her fist around the hurt. They reached a slot where voices fell in thin from on high. The words were plain and ugly. They were the kind of words men use when there is no woman within hearing and no child, and they want to prove something to one another and to themselves. Silas Rook's voice was not there. The men had his money, though. The jingle of it was a sound like a grin. Satay touched Honor's elbow once. It steadied her more than a speech would have. He drew a map in the dust with the end of his knife, lines and dots and arrows. He made a little fire with dry grass and blew at it until it made smoke without flame, and then he fed it with a twist of sage and a scrap of cloth, soaked in the strong coffee Honor had carried in her trunk, and then in her pocket, in case there was ever a morning that needed it. The smoke went up in a ribbon and drifted toward the canyon mouth, where the men would see it and ride for it. He let it build, and then he put it out with a palm of dirt and left the smell hanging like bait. He took the three of them around to a place where rocks made funnels that caught sound and threw it back with extra teeth. He set Honor behind a slab where a bullet would have to be clever to find her, and handed her the small file as if it were a knife and a vow. She wrapped cloth around the handle and held it low. She did not say she was afraid. She was. She had a will that stood up anyway. Up on the rim, the first horseman rode toward the thin line of smoke with his head high, like a man who expects the world to yield. The second followed with his eyes down, like a man who expects snakes. The third kicked his horse in the belly because a horse is easier to hurt than a plan. The sound of hooves on stone became a drumming that made a body think of bad weather and armies. Satay put 2 fingers to his lips and made a sound that was not a whistle, not a word. It was a sign to Pahi that meant now. Pahi's rifle spoke once, and then again, not at men, but at stone. The echoes turned 1 shot into 2, 2 into 4. The men grabbed for reins and for courage and dropped both. One fired blind. The bullet hit the painted shield and slid off like a boy's marble off a door. Another bullet hit rock and spit a shard that cut Honor's cheek with a bee sting and made her eyes water. She did not move. After the first hard minute, the canyon went quiet, except for a groan that might have been a man or a horse or the earth settling. Satay looked at Honor and nodded once. She did not feel brave. She felt used up and still moving. It would have to do. They broke cover and moved before courage had time to fade. They got to the flat where later a ring of fire would burn, and men would speak and argue and measure each other. Pahi looked at the ground and read what had just happened like a school book. He pointed with the barrel of his rifle to the place where a horse had gone down on its knees and got up again with a shudder. He pointed to a mark where a boot heel had dug in as a man turned to run, then turned back because pride yanked harder than fear. He smiled his joyless smile and then turned his head because he heard something else. From the far ridge the sound of more men came, and with it a shape that was not small and not their own. Blue coats on the rim, cavalry, a line of men who followed orders instead of signs. Silas Rook had bought himself more than cutthroats. He had bought himself the law in numbers. Sheriff Ellison rode between them with his hat driven low, like a man who has ridden through a place where the wind takes hats and leaves heads. His face was gray and set. He lifted his hand once, and the column stopped. Satay did a thing then that was not expected. He took the crumpled warrant and the trading post tally and tucked them under his arm like a man carries wood. He stepped into the open with the painted shield low and his hands high and his palms out so the clay lines could be seen. He moved slow. He did not stop until he had come far enough that any man with a rifle could make a story of him. He spoke. The wind took the edges off his words. The captain on the rim leaned down and listened and frowned, not at the man below, but at the shape of the day and the way it had turned. Sheriff Ellison pushed his horse forward and spoke down the slope to a man he did not know, and Sate spoke up to a man he had heard about in the way men who live by reading others hear about each other. Honor watched them and held her breath and felt the pull that runs between two men who both think they keep a kind of order. She took one step out from behind the rock and then another, because there are moments when to hide is to confess, and she had nothing left to confess that was not a man's lie. She let the sun touch the lines on her wrist. She let the clay speak where it could. Silence held for a heartbeat too long and then broke. From behind the rim rock to the right, a rifle cracked in the cheap hard way a hired man shoots. The bullet came straight and fast for the place where a woman stood with a folded paper at her breast. Sheriff Ellison moved like a man who has decided what his life is for. He put his horse between the gun and the woman, and then put his own body between the horse and the shot. The horse shied. The bullet found the meat of Ellison's side where it would ruin a lung if it went deep. He made a sound that was more surprise than pain. He slid in the saddle, then reached for the horn and missed, and went down like a sack of feed dropped from a wagon. The world held its breath again, not because it cared about any one man, but because the shape of the day had turned a corner, and everyone could feel the angle. Sate did not look at where Ellison fell. He went for the bluff, with a run a man does not make unless he has hunted on that grade since he was a boy. He moved like water when it finds the cut it has been looking for. He went to where the hired rifleman lay behind a rock with his mouth open in a smile, like he had already tasted what he had done and wanted seconds. Sate reached him before the man got his second shot off. The fight that came after was short and dirt and teeth and iron and breath that had no room to come and go both. Honor stood with the warrant and the tally and the broken file in one hand and her blood on her cheek, turning brown in the sun, and did not move, because now she could not. Agnes Wainwright would later write in her ledger, "One death under color of law." She would blot the name after she wrote it. She would close the book. She would keep her hand on it a long time, as if warmth could change ink. The sheriff's deposition will tell you no horse returned and no coin changed hands. Yet one horse came home bleeding silver into the dust, and one coin's ring was heard by every man who bent to the saddlebag and lied to himself that he had not heard it. Next, you will hear the words they tried to erase, and see the name, the priest, cut free. Sate's shoulder hit the bluff and took the skin off in a long sheet that would sting later. The hired rifleman's breath came in a pant that smelled like liquor, turned sharp in the sun. He lifted his gun with the sloppy speed of a man used to shooting into crowds, and not at men who rushed him uphill. Sate knocked the barrel wide with the painted shield and drove his knife down, not messy, not showy, only once, where a man stops being a problem. Dust leaped and hung. The hawk bells at Sate's wrist chimed once and fell still. He looked down and saw the kind of face that believes its own lies and is offended to be proved wrong. He took the man's rifle and rolled the body so the blood would run away from the throat and not pool where it would draw flies in a minute. He did not spit. He did not say a word over the dead. On the rim, the captain held up a hand to keep his line from answering fire with more fire. He kept his eyes on Sate as the Comanche walked out from behind the rock without the rifleman and with a second rifle slung. The captain did not like being in a story he had not written. He had a face that kept its own counsel, a drover's mustache, and a way of watching that meant he had seen a war and had learned that uniforms did not make men smarter. Sheriff Ellison lay with his hand clapped to his side, eyes open, breath pulling like a saw through green wood. He said the captain's name and got only half of it out. The captain slid down a few feet with the easy care of a man who had done dumb things before and learned to do them with grace, and he put his body between the sheriff and any follow-up shot that might come from a fool with a second rifle. He shouted without turning his head, Stand your men off. Nobody fires unless I do. Honor moved to Ellison and went to her knees. Her hand was already on the wound, pressing, where the blood came hot and bright through his shirt. He sucked in air, and his eyes cleared a little. That'll hurt you, he said with a little crooked apology in his voice. You owe me no comfort. She kept pressure steady. I owe myself the truth, she said, and it was said with such plainness that Ellison looked away, because a decent man finds plain truth hard to look in the eye when he hasn't kept it. Silas Rook walked his horse to the fore with the careful pace of a man who wants witnesses. He had a white hat he wore to funerals and big meetings, and he wore it now. The wind found the brim and could not take it. He looked straight down at Honor and made his voice carry without shouting. This has gone on too far, he said. Sheriff, you and I both know where duty lies. The captain lifted his chin 1 degree toward Silas, without taking his eyes off Satay. You are not the law out here, he said, mild as milk and hard as a steel trap. You may be used to giving orders to boys at your ranch, Mr. Rook. My men are not your boys. Padre Valdez came then, at a ride that would make a saint swear. He had the parish register wrapped in oilcloth and tied under his arm, and a look on his face like a man who has been braver than he knew he could be, and hopes God keeps count. He slid down, and almost fell, and caught himself with a hand on the horn. He did not go to Silas. He went to the captain, and to Honor, and to Ellison. He crossed himself fast, not formal. He said a prayer under his breath that had more longing than Latin. He set the book down, and untied it, and laid it open to the place where the cut once name was a clean white mouth in the page. You will look, he said to the captain, not asking. You will look, and you will hear. His hands shook. He set them on the leather at the corners, and they steadied. Silas smiled the way he smiled when he wanted men to believe he had already won. Father, he said, soft, with a little laugh in it, this is not a matter for your desk. Padre Valdez lifted his eyes and found Silas with a look that had tiredness and anger and pity all together in one pot. Sin is my desk, he said. So is confession. So is the record men try to ruin. He looked to Honor without moving his head. Child, he said, though she was not a child. What would you have me say? Honor did not look at Silas either. She looked at the clean mouth in the page. She said, say what it is. Say who cut it. Say why. The captain put a knee to the dirt and bent over the book, and let his shadow fall over the page to kill glare, and he saw the straight edge where a knife had gone. He saw the fine hairs of paper lifted along the cut, like a field after hail. Padre Valdez said, I cut it. I cut the man's name, who would have held her by ink, like iron, before any posse rode, before any bargain was made. By right of my office, and in fear of my God, I cut it. If there is sin in this, lay it at my feet, and not at hers. He swallowed and kept going, because a man who decides to tell the whole truth cannot stop halfway down. He told me he would save her from herself. He told me the town needed quiet. He put his money on my table. I took his hand, and I saw the way his eyes went flat when his mouth smiled. I cut the name to keep a soul from being brought under a brand. Silas Rook laughed then, not loud, but the kind of laugh that walks around a room and leaves a smell. So a priest destroys a lawful contract, he said, and an outlaw. He flicked his eyes at Satay and let contempt show like lace. Claims a woman with dirt on his palms. Is this the order of things you mean to enforce, Captain? The captain did not rise to it. He touched the page with one finger, as if to feel whether truth had a temperature. We are going to do something rare today, he said. We are going to think. Pahi rode the line of the bluff, while the white men argued and read. He counted men, counted rifles, counted eyes that could be steady under command, and eyes that would yank at a trigger when a word got under their skin. He came back and touched Satay's hand, without anyone seeing it, and made a small motion that meant watch the left. Satay nodded without looking. He had the painted shield, set where it could catch a fool shot. He had his knife in his belt, because he knew the sight of a naked blade makes men stupider. Agnes Wainwright arrived on a mule that hated the day, and said so with every step. She had the ledger in her saddlebag, and a jaw set like a door when the wind tries to take it. She had not been invited. She came anyway. She passed Silas, who did not see her, and she passed a private whose boots were too big for him, and she came to Honor, and looked at her wrists with a professional eye, and at her cheek with a mother's. She put her fingers near the wound, and did not touch it. "You can tell a lot from an edge," she said to no one. "A clean cut tells a story. A ragged one tells another." She took her ledger out and set it beside the priest's book, like a strange altar. "I will not name the hand that put coin to my counter," she said into air that had 100 ears, "but I will show the line." She opened to July. The words were plain: removal, 2 iron bracelets, cash only, before sunrise. No name. The ink had bit deep. She had pressed too hard the day she wrote it, because she had been angry at herself. Silas shifted in his saddle as if the horse had stepped on a thorn. He turned his head toward Marjorie, because he could feel the air change around him, and he knew it was time to find a weaker wall. She had come while the others argued, walking fast, dress hem dark with dust. She had the little folded confession she had written in the night, when the house made sounds that had nothing to do with air and pipes, and everything to do with the way shame will speak when lights are out. She held the paper, as if it had heat. She looked at Honor, and saw the girl she had shared a straw tick with, on nights when the roof drummed with rain, and their mother coughed, and could not stop. She looked at Silas, and saw the man who had called her pretty, and meant pliable. She looked at the priest, and saw a pair of hands that had done harm to prevent a harm, and would pay for it with sleep. She stepped into the circle without asking, and lifted the paper. "I signed what he put before me," she said, in a voice that almost broke, and then did not. "He told me it would save her. He told me it would save me. He told me he would marry me if she were proved unfit. I believed him. There is a file in his tack room, with a spur ground down, to make a letter look like another. I can show it. I can show where he hid it, when I came toward the door, and he thought I did not see." She breathed like a woman who has run above her strength. Silas flinched once, a tiny thing in the muscle by his eye that would not have shown if the sun had not been so honest. He smoothed it with a smile and spread his hands in a gesture that had made juries like him. "A poor girl," he said, confused, easily led, guilty, and looking for absolution in noise. He let his voice ease into pity. He made everybody else the bully. He turned his horse half a step and let the movement be a threat that could be called accident, if anyone called it at all. The captain had listened to men and women make cases for years. He had heard the pitch of liars and the steadiness of truth-tellers who did not know they were brave. He stood up from the book and dusted his hand like a man who has touched flour. He looked at Silas, and at Marjorie, and at the priest, and at the undertaker, and at Honor, and at the Comanche, whose silence took up more space than most men's words. He drew a breath. "Paper will fight paper," he said, "and words will fight words. While they do, no one fires. I'll have a man go with this young lady to the tack room she mentioned. I'll have another fetch what tools there are for brands at your ranch, Mr. Rook. Father, you will bring your book to camp, and you will sit in the shade with a guard, and you will not go to your chapel until I say you may. Mrs. Wainwright, your ledger will do the same. Sheriff," his mouth tightened a fraction, "you will live if you mind this woman's hands." He nodded to Honor at the pressure on the wound. "You will die if you try to talk." Ellison breathed a laugh that hurt him. He managed, "Yes, sir, because a man can be both in charge and obedient when the day makes it needful." He looked at Honor and found her eyes and tried to say a thing he had owed her, but his lungs would not buy enough air to purchase it. She bent just a little and put her ear near his mouth, like a child at story time. He made the effort and found a piece of the words. I should have read it to you," he said, meaning the paper, then meaning everything. "I should have stood between. I am sorry." She kept her hand on his side and said, "Stand now." He breathed once like a man who believed he might. Satay watched the way authority tried to build a bridge over a river of lies, and wished for simpler days, when a man could tell truth with his knife and be done. He did not despise the attempt. He only understood that men with papers liked to pretend their words made the world. He put the painted shield at the edge of the meeting place where it could look like decoration and be a wall. He saw Pahi's head come up like a deer's, and he looked to the left where Pahi had told him to watch. He saw a flick of movement low in the brush, a glint of sun off the side of a rifle barrel, where it shouldn't be if the captain's order had sunk in. He did not move, because sometimes not moving keeps a fool from deciding to shoot. 2 troopers brought back a brand iron from Rook's ranch in a gunny sack, as if it might jump and bite. Marjorie walked with them and did not look at Silas. She led them to the tack room with the file, and she knelt in the dust and reached under a plank where splinters had picked her fingers more than once, and she drew out a wrapped thing. She shook it into the light the way you shake a snake from a boot, like let it be what it is. The spur had been ground to change a letter. The flat of the brand iron showed where a file had eaten it, and left marks too, even to be accident. The captain took these and did not smile. He liked facts that you could cut your hand on. He took them to the circle. He laid them beside the priest's book and the undertaker's ledger and the trading post tally, as if one could make a fence out of paper and iron, sufficient to pen a bully. Silas tried one more turn. He dismounted with a show of respect and dignity, and stood with his hands behind his back, like a man ready to submit to reason. He kept his voice low, so men would have to lean to hear. "Captain," he said, "I speak as a neighbor and a man of means in this county. If you allow Comanche to hold court over a white woman with your men standing by, you write a lesson our boys will read wrong. If you allow a priest to mutilate the public record, you call it open season on every bond. If you let a gossiping sister and a bent old undertaker's widow set the price of a gentleman's reputation, you will not find another gentleman willing to pay for progress here. You must make an example. You must bring her into custody. You must return my property and my paper." He said property like it included more than cattle and wood. He held the word in his mouth like a sugar that had melted. The captain had a way of being quiet that made other men hear themselves. He let Silas's words fall, and he looked at Honor and saw the wrist marks and the way she did not hide them, and he looked at Sate and saw a line of clay that had been remade, and he looked at Marjorie and saw a woman who had done wrong and then walked into the room where wrong sits and says its prayers. He said, "You mistake me for a judge. I am a man with men and horses and orders that do not cover everything. I will not take a woman on a paper that stinks. I will not hand a man back his blade when he has filed it to fit a throat he has chosen. Stand down, Mr. Rook." Silas's face went white around the mouth then, the way a man goes when something in him breaks, and you get to see what was under the paint. He lifted his hand an inch and dropped it, and then lifted it again, because habit is hard to shove off, even when the moment calls for something else. He looked at the hired man lying behind the rock and saw the empty where his instrument had been. He reckoned himself cleverer than he was, and quick where he was only slippery. He did the thing a man like him always does when words stop working. He reached for force. He went for the pistol at his hip. He went for honor, because he wanted the circle to end with his hand on the hinge. He had made 100 small calculations that had taught him he could step into any room and draw the line where he liked. He had not calculated Sate's hand on the air without a sound, or Pahi moving before the thought had entirely formed in his own mind, or Marjorie, poor trembling Marjorie, stepping between him and her sister with her little crumpled confession, and her dress that had been washed so often the color had quit, standing there like a fence post hammered into stone by a woman too tired to give way. Silas's pistol came up. The captain's hand went down for his own. Sate was moving. Pahi's rifle was shouldered. The world threw every detail into hard relief. The hawk's shadow crossing the ground, the sweat line under Sate's hair, the 2 letters of ink that showed at the top edge of a photograph sleeve peeking from a medic's satchel, where some hospital man had tucked it and forgotten. It was a picture of wrists, smooth as marble now, long-heeled, taken at Fort Richardson by a bored man who liked to catalog scars. The The sleeve had HQ written in a quick man's hand. No one there saw this yet. It was the sort of detail that waits its turn and then changes everything after the dust settles. Silas's shot cracked. It hit the painted shield because Sate had been where he needed to be and had learned the angle of a certain kind of man. The bullet sang off, went wicked, cut a line along Pahi's upper arm, and took a button from the captain's coat, like a boast. Pahi's rifle spoke back, with more principle. He put a bullet into Silas's gun hand, and not his heart. The pistol flew with a sound, like a dropped hammer. Silas made a howl that was part rage, part shock, part the boy he had been when a father cuffed him for breaking china he had been told not to touch. The captain closed the step between them with a tackle that took them both into the dust and ground dignity into white powder. Men on the rim wanted to fire. Boys wanted to prove things. The captain's sergeant, who had a voice that could stop cattle, bellowed once and made a quiet that felt like a chapel. "Nobody," he said, "fires. You fire. You walk home without a coat." It worked because men will do mad things and they will do brave things, but most will not do both. Naked. The line held. Ellison breathed thin. Honor kept her hand where it was and counted backward from a number that meant nothing to anyone but her. Padre Valdez knelt beside them and took Ellison's free hand and spoke a thing in Spanish that had the shape of a psalm and the truth of a confession. Agnes Wainwright held her ledger like a shield made of paper and the memory of dead men's faces. Marjorie cried without sound and did not move from where she stood, though dust from the captain's tackle came up and painted her dress the color of the plain. When the scuffle's sting went out of the air, the captain had Silas on his stomach with his good hand wrenched up and his other wrapped in his own kerchief, already red. The captain's voice went very gentle. "Mr. Rook," he said, "you will not move without my leave. If you do, the young Comanche with the notched ear will put a second hole in you, and I will not lose sleep." Silas made a sound like a promise, and then swallowed it because he did not like the taste. The captain stood, his coat missing a button, his hair full of grit, his mustache looking like it had seen a rain. He said, "Sergeant Irons." The sergeant, a man who did not hurry unless a snake was near his boot, brought shackles and put them on a man who had bought shackles at a post a day before and found out how a circle works. After that first hard turn, the day settled into a different kind of tension, taut and breath held. The captain made a little camp in the shade of cottonwoods where documents could sit and not curl. He set 2 troopers beside the priest and the undertaker, like bookends. He set a third by Marjorie, who shook and smoothed her dress, and shook again. He sent 4 men to bring water, and set a 5th to watch the horizon for dust that would mean the day had decided to bring more company. He said to Honor, "You keep that man alive, and we will count you paid." She said, "It does not pay the debt I carry," and he did not argue. Sate stood apart because he was not invited to sit, and because he did not ask. He watched the way white men handled trouble and thought about how often they built a scaffold when a shelter would do. He looked once toward Honor, and she looked back, and there was something past there that was not romance, and not pity, and not some story the town would tell later, with sighs. It was recognition, the kind people share who have had iron on them, one kind or another, and do not intend to wear it again. He tapped once at the clay line, and then let his hand hang loose. Afternoon slid toward evening. Heat lifted like a fog you can smell. A breeze came from the north that tasted like a blue norther's scout and carried the promise of a storm that would make men curse ropes and be grateful for roofs. The captain looked up like a farmer and sighed because he had seen men kill one another over less than shelter in a hard rain. He said, "We finish this before the sky does." He sent a man to the mission to fetch a blank sheet of official paper and another to fetch a gnawed pencil, because in the field, men bind things with what they have. Padre Valdez, under guard and under the eye of every man who had ever twitched at a cassock, set his jaw and prepared to write what he could not keep in his own book. Agnes opened her ledger again and let the captain run a finger over the line that had cut her sleep. Marjorie, dry-eyed now, told the story of the file and the brand iron and the promise that had made her stupid, and she told it plain, not to spare herself and not to hurt her sister, but because it was time, and there was not much of it. Honor said the words she had to say about the men who had chained her, and the way they had vanished with her trunk, and she said where the chain pinched, and where it burned, and where the iron had split under a knife that understood metal, and where Sate had set clay where iron had been. She said it with a schoolteacher's rhythm and a widow's restraint. Every sentence had a spine. Silas attempted to speak 3 times, and got told no with words each time shorter than the last. He lay in the dirt with irons on, and found that humiliation tastes like old pennies and dust and your own breath in your own face. He thought of the men in town who had told him he was the future in boots. He thought of the boys who had watched him and practiced his draw. He thought of the line his father had said to him when he was 12 and got caught stealing a bull from a neighbor's pen, that a rook never apologized, because owning the land meant owning the tail, told about it. He tried to find a way to own this tail, and could not. The storm's smell got stronger. A far peal of thunder rolled the way a wagon does on a plank bridge. The captain held his hat down as the first big drops came, slow and hard, spaced out like a drummer learning a new pattern. He swore soft, because he had hoped to sleep under a sky that did not leak. He looked at the priest's paper, and at the ledger, and at the brand iron, and he said, "We will take this to the fort. There will be a board who wants to see men in chairs, and not on dirt. But I will tell you plain in front of God and soldier, I am going to put this man in irons, and I am not going to take this woman anywhere but under a roof with coffee and bread, unless she tells me no. If that offends a judge, he can write me a letter while I stand in his office and read it back to him." Honor looked at him and felt something inside unclench that had been knotted since she had put Silas's ring back in his hand. She looked to Sata, and his eyes said what his mouth would not in a language older than this county. Not finished, but on the right road. Pahi turned his face into the rain like a boy and let the drops hit his tongue and made a small sound of delight to be alive. Then the lightning came close enough that the hair on a man's arm would stand. The thunder came in under it like a barfall. The cottonwoods shook and shook water down on everybody, so nobody could tell tears from weather. The storm made a curtain that let a certain kind of man think he could creep. 2 of Silas's leftover cutthroats, the ones who had not died or run far enough, slid along the low ground where mesquite made holes for men who lived in holes. They had a plan as bad as their luck. They went for the mission book because Silas had told them to take back what had been cut, and fools will take orders, past the point where orders make sense. Agnes saw the first of them because undertakers watch edges. She drew breath enough to make a warning. Pahi heard it first because his ears were tuned to trouble. He moved and his arm bled fresh, and he did not feel it because there was movement to be done. Sate was already dropping his center of gravity and turning to the sound. The captain, whose back had taught him how to move under unexpected fire a decade earlier, threw himself toward the books. The cutthroat closest reached with a hand that had taken more than it had ever given, and found a priest's hand on the other side that had learned to hold and not let thieves walk off with souls. The man lifted a knife that was not brave. Sate's hand closed on his wrist. The pressure he put there was not angry, only inevitable. The knife went away. The second man came up out of the brush with a pistol that had been kept dry under his shirt. He saw Sate's back and raised the gun and saw an open shot and felt satisfaction flash and lifted his chin to taste it like a dog tasting fat, skimmed from soup. He did not see Honor move because he did not think she would. She had the broken file wrapped in cloth. She had soaked and tied and soaked again. She stepped in and brought it across the man's wrist with a straight cut that hit tendon and made his hand forget how to hold. The pistol fell and went off into the mud and took no one. Honor stood with the file in her hand and a look in her eye that Silas had tried to name and had only ever mislabeled. It was not temper. It was a decision, old as bone. After that quick was over, the longer business began again. Binding, talking, writing, breathing. Ellison drifted and swam back and drifted. At one of the surfacings, he caught Honor's eyes and said, "Tell Sophia." And Honor said, "I will." And that was all he needed to count himself square with the ledger he kept in his heart. The medic from the troop set the wound and left a roll of clean bandage and a word that sounded like hope and not the other thing. As the worst of the storm passed and left that blue-black edge that means more behind it, the captain said, "We move to the mission. Roof beats cottonwood. I will not march these people in chains through town for the sake of a drunk wag's story." He had Silas stood up and put on a horse that did not like him and showed it with a lot of white eye. He put 2 men at either knee. He said to Sate, "I cannot keep you from doing as you will. If you ride with us, I will not thank you in public. I will not forget either." Sate considered. He looked at Honor. She put her palm up once where he could see the clay line had worn to a shadow. He nodded. He whistled low for Pahi and for the horse that had come riderless, and for his own. They made a shape around the little procession that was not guard and not escort and not a raiding party. It was simply presence, old and calm and unwilling to let fools take the day. They came to the mission as dusk folded and the bell tolled once by Padre Valdez's hand, because sometimes you ring the bell not for mass, but to tell the world to look. The chapel smelled like wax and damp stone. Candles guttered and got their legs under them. The scar in the register's page looked whiter in candlelight than it had under sun. Agnes set her ledger on a rail near the altar and stepped back as if she had set down a hot pan. Marjorie stood near a saint with a chipped foot and put her hand on the plaster because she could not trust her own knees. Honor walked the aisle with Ellison's stretcher at her side because she had put her hand in to carry, and she was not going to take it out until there was a bed. Sate came to the doorway and stopped there like a man at the edge of another man's house, who knows how to be mannerly and how not to tangle his own rules with someone else's here and there. God. The captain set his men where rifles made sense and disrespect did not. He had one of them take Silas to the side room where penitents usually whispered. He put him on a chair with his hands in irons and 2 soldiers who did not like him on either side. Silas sat very still and made his face blank and tried to think 2 moves ahead and found that his mind, usually so quick, was like a wagon in mud. He looked at the altar rail where Honor would stand if she came up to speak. He amused himself for a brief sick moment by imagining the world where she knelt and put her head down and he put his hand on it. Then he smiled to himself, a ghost of a smile. He was not done. He was never done. Men like him break like green sticks, not like glass. They splinter and snag. The priest, in his own house now, grew spine. He laid the books as if they were relics. He faced the little gathering that had inside it every kind of witness you needed to tell a story that would stand. He spoke without ornament. "I cut a name," he said. "I will answer for that. She was to be bound to a man whose oaths were made of smoke. I will answer for that. The law will be angry. God will be just. I have looked in both faces before." He turned to Honor. "You may speak here without being interrupted," he said. "You may name a sin without a shout coming back over you. You may leave out what you choose. You may add what you had to leave out in worse rooms." Honor stood and said what needed saying, and no more. She did not put sorrow on like a shawl to be admired. She did not put rage on like a badge to pace the aisle. She placed facts like stones in a river to make a crossing. When she finished, she put her hand flat over the place on the rail where 100 hands had worn the wood smooth and felt the groove and let the feeling travel up into the part of her that was still shaking. She lifted her chin and met the eyes of every man who could not quite meet hers. She found Sate in the doorway and found there a steadiness that was not approval and not ownership and not rescue and not kinship, and somehow it was all of those, but stripped of the parts that do harm. Agnes spoke next and did not tremble. She told what coins sound like in a small room when you have left a dead man to his wife and his wife has left her grief to you, because that is what happens when there's no one else to take it. She told why she had written no name. She told whom she suspected, and why she had let suspicion starve, because to feed it would have turned into a fight she did not yet have breath for. Marjorie told last, and looked directly at Honor, when she said that she had wanted what Honor had not wanted, and had been willing to hurt her to get it. Honor flinched once, and then stepped to her sister, and set her hand on her shoulder, like a woman set hand to hand when there is nothing clever to do. The captain cleared his throat, and made a cough that was a kind of gavel. "That will do," he said. "In the morning, I will take this man and these books to the fort, and there will be talk under roofs, and a lot of writing. For tonight, we sleep. The doors will be watched. There will be no late errands. There will be no whispering in corners. Mr. Rook," he turned his head toward the side room, "if you need the privy, you will ask. If you do not ask, you will sit in what you make." The soldiers in the room added a quiet, almost kind laughter that has no joy in it. Night drew itself tight around the mission. Rain came again, and then a straight wind that made the bell line hum like a plucked string. The candles guttered and kept their feet. Men drowsed sitting against pews with hats over faces. The sergeant walked like a church cat making his rounds. Padre Valdez sat with his book and his hands on it like a man who had married a dangerous wife and loved her anyway. Agnes slept with her ledger under her arm. Marjorie slept and woke and slept and woke, and each time she was farther from the girl who had thought herself coy, and closer to the woman who could do penance without being told. Honor could not sleep. She stood in the doorway beside Satay and looked out into the black and smelled the world. The rain had brought up the green that hides under dirt. It smelled like a forgiven sin. Satay did not look at her, but he felt her there and let his weight ease to one hip, the way you do when you mean to stay a while. He made a small circle in the wet dust with a boot toe. He said a sentence so short it could have been a grunt. "When your chain is undone in paper, then I cut mine." He lifted his palm and showed the clay line that had blurred in rain and been smudged by rope and fight and time. Honor lifted her wrist and showed hers, mostly gone now. "When my chain is undone in paper," she said, "I will not be anyone's to cut. I will stand." He nodded once as if she had given him a fact he could count on. He liked facts. In the deep of the night, men who had been left out of the day's story came to write their own with knives. Two of Silas's hands, the loyal kind whose loyalty is built on favors and fear, crept to the mission door with a strip of cloth soaked in lamp oil and a flint. They thought fire would make a new page. They had not counted on Pahi sitting in the rafters above the door, balanced on a beam like a swallow, because he liked the way night sounded up there. When the first man scratched at steel, Pahi dropped from the beam as soft as a draped shawl and took the cloth and lit it with the thief's own spark and held it up under the man's nose so he could smell exactly what he had planned for women and books. The man went white and dropped to his knees with his hands up like a child at play. The second ran. Satay was outside and caught him by the back of his coat, the way you catch a boy when he steals apples, and gives himself away with pulp on his lips. He marched him in by the scruff like a mother dog. The captain did not rise from where he lay because he had learned that men wake better when they see their officers are not frightened by every creak. He said, "Sergeant," and the sergeant did what men should do when their officers do not perform for them. He took the two would-be fire-setters out and tied them to the hitch rail under the dripping eaves and left them there, like ornaments in a bad season. "Rain will keep you soft," he said, and went back in. Honor watched it all and did not smile. She did not have smiling left for that kind of work. She had the kind you save for mornings when you open your eyes, and the thing that hunted you has died in its burrow. Dawn came late under Storm's tail, a gray that made faces new. The captain drank coffee that would strip paint and sighed like a man who had slept enough to want more. He called for horses. He called for books. He called for men to stand where they could be counted. He put Silas on the mule because the horse had decided overnight to hate him in a way that could not be negotiated. He put the priest in the wagon with his register on his lap like a baby. He set Agnes in beside him, because she had declared she was not letting her ledger out of her sight, and you could not argue with a woman who had spent her life arguing with grief and winning enough to stay in business. He put Marjorie on a docile mare that had seen 3 wars and given birth twice, and would die in a year with dignity. He looked around for Honor. She stood in the chapel a last minute with her hand on the cut place in the page. She did not cry. She did not pray out loud. She only memorized the shape of that white space, so that when men told her later what had and had not been, she could tell them what she had seen with her own eyes and could not be moved from. She turned then and walked out with the air of a woman who had decided she would not cinch anything around her wrists again that she had not chosen for herself. Outside, Sate sat his horse like a carved thing, and Pahi grinned his lopsided grin and showed the place where a bullet had kissed him and left a welt to brag about. They moved in a slow, small caravan toward the fort, half procession and half convoy of evidence. The sky held its rain until they were a mile out, and then spent it all in one big laugh that washed the last of the clay from Honor's wrist and the last of the heat from the ground and knocked dust out of the air, so that the world looked closer than it had the day before. They traveled under this clean, as if the day meant to give them a do-over, and would not, but like to pretend. On the rise above the cottonwood bend where the road turns, a line of men on foot stood like fence posts. They had hunting rifles and borrowed courage, and a preacher with them, who had been loud against Comanche, and louder against women who spoke. He raised his Bible like a warrant. He shouted words that sounded like thunder if you didn't listen, and like gossip if you did. He called Honor by the names men use when they need their own wives to be small. He called Sate by the names men use when they are afraid. He called the captain a traitor to his color. He called the priest a whore for the old world. He called the undertaker a ghoul. He called Marjorie a Magdalene, without remembering that story ends with a woman first at the tomb. The captain reined in and looked at the line and counted boys who might run and men who would shoot if the man next to them shot first. He took off his hat and turned it in his hands once, and then put it back on, because hair plastered to a skull is a poor look for a leader. He said in a voice as big as a courthouse clock, "If you mean to block the road, you will be moved. If you mean to make speeches, take your turn behind my men when we get to the fort and sign your names to them. If you mean to kill, say so plain and get on with it. I am tired, and I am clean out of patience for men who think their fear is instruction." He did not shout. He spoke the way a man speaks in a kitchen when he has told a child to stop sticking a fork in a wall plug, and the child is about to do it anyway. Silence held. The preacher looked to Silas, chained on a mule, and did not like the future he saw there. He lowered his Bible, because a book is heavy when your arm shakes. The line broke like a poorly braided rope. Men stepped back and swallowed curses and hate, and the taste that comes when you have to stand aside for something you despise and cannot stop. One of them spat. It hit his own boot. They went on. At the fort gate, a guard who had once been a boy in Honor's school and had written his letters on slate with his tongue stuck out, opened the gate wide because he remembered a teacher who had slapped his hand away when he tried to cheat and then gave him an apple for trying to improve later. He did not salute because his hands were full of rain and because he was not that kind of soldier. Inside the long, low room, the army called an office, and the rest of the world called a place where men kept each other honest, or didn't. The captain laid down the books, and the brand iron, and the tally, and the warrant, and said, "There is your case." A board whose faces were made of chairs, and ink, and the memory of marches sat, and read, and frowned, and leaned over to one another to mutter, and then remembered that men who mutter in public look weak. One of them asked how a priest came to cut a lawful page. Padre Valdez said, "With a penknife," before the man could finish, and a corporal at the back had to cover a cough that might have been a laugh. Another asked if a Comanche's oath could be weighed like a white man's word. The captain looked at Sate and then back at the board and said, "We will weigh men by their acts today." No one answered, because there is not a good answer to that leaves your prejudices whole. Honor gave her statement with the rain still wet on her skirt. Silas gave his with a tight bandage on his hand and a tone that made the room colder. Marjorie gave hers with both hands clenched and eyes straight. Agnes set her ledger on the table and pushed it toward the men, like a plate of meat they had earned, and she would not force on them, but they would be fools not to take. The board took it. They wrote more. They rubbed their eyes. The afternoon went on. Men shifted. Satte's shadow moved 3 inches across the floor and stopped because the light stopped. They called a halt and said they would put the gentleman in the lockup and the woman in a guest house and the priest in his chapel and the undertaker wherever undertakers go and the Comanche wherever Comanche go when white men are nervous. The captain said no on the last count because a man will pick his battles, and he picked that one. In a room where an army doctor kept tidy horrors, a medic took a photograph of Honor's wrists because he was a collector of such curiosities, and someone had told him you could see the way skin knit after iron if you caught it with a camera and a good chemical bath. He slid the negative into a sleeve and wrote HQ on it with a stub of pencil and set it in a tray and forgot it. Years later, a clerk would find it and wonder whose hands had been turned into light and shadow and stored like a memory that belonged to everyone and no one. For now, it was just one more proof piled on a high stack a tired captain would have to carry up the hill of other men's opinions. When night gathered at the fort, Honor sat alone in a little room with a window too high to see out of and a bed that looked like a cot because it was. Bread sat on a plate. Coffee steamed in a cup. The smell of stewed meat tried to be comfort and nearly made it. She put her hands flat on her knees and looked at them and could not tell any longer where the clay line had been because rain had been thorough. She should have felt free. She felt like a woman in the hinge between 2 doors. She heard a soft sound at the window like a bird's foot. She looked up. Satte's face was a shadow with eyes. He did not come in. He did not call. He lifted his hand and let it sit there in the square of dark as a way of saying, "Here." Honor stood and went to the window and set her palm to the pane. He set his to the other side. It was not romance. It was recognition again, and it was a promise that men do not understand when they write romances about women they call fierce, to make themselves feel softer. It said, when men are done writing on paper, we will write our own lines on the world. He drew his hand away. He was gone. Honor let her own hand fall and looked down at it. It did not tremble. It would later, but not now. In the morning, the board would read and stamp and argue and write and take testimony again. In the morning, the captain would shave like a man ready to insult a judge to his face. In the morning, Silas would wake and discover that humiliation can ferment overnight and turn to poison that makes a man crazy enough to try breaking chains with his teeth. In the morning, Marjorie would take a step she could not take back and would not want to. In the morning, Agnes would tear a page out of her own ledger and keep it in her dress pocket because she had learned that sometimes the only way to keep a thing safe is to split it. For now there was the sound of the fort breathing, men turning in bunks, a guard's boot heel on wood, rain drifting away toward the nations, the bell at the mission 2 miles off giving a single note because a rope had shifted in wind. The narrator lowered his voice and set one last clue on the table like a coin. In the coroner's inquest that would follow the next day, there would be a line marked, "One death under color of law," and the name first written would not be the name finally blotted. Next, you will see which hand held the blotter and why a thumbprint in red stayed on the page after the ink was long dry. The board sat like furniture that had learned to talk, and the room smelled of wet wool and ink. Rain ticked in the stovepipe, and ghosts of steam rose off men's hats set on pegs. A clerk sharpened a pencil to a spear point and wrote, "Coroner's inquest to follow," without lifting his eyes. The captain stood with his hands behind his back and his boots leaving clean wet prints on the plank floor. He looked not at the board, not at Silas, not at the priest, or the undertaker, or the sisters. He looked at the open door as if the weather itself might walk in and cast a deciding vote. Sate stood just inside that door, a taller shadow in the frame, rain beaded in his hair. The painted shield leaned against the wall like a quiet animal. The coroner came in with a case under his arm, and the air of a man who had spent too long looking at people after the world had taken their names off. He set out instruments like a lunch pail, pen, blotter, a book with ruled lines and a leather hinge. He nodded to the captain, to the board, to the priest. He did not nod to Silas. There are some men undertakers, and coroners do not nod to, because life is short and respect is a small coin. He asked for the first matter. The captain said, "The dead rifleman above Palo Duro, cause and circumstance." The coroner dipped his pen and wrote. He asked, "Under authority?" The captain said, "Apprehension in progress." The coroner wrote, "One death under color of law." He lifted his pen for the next line, "By whose hand?" and the room tightened, as if a belt had been cinched 2 holes too far. Silas half smiled with a split lip and said in a voice meant for the coroner's ear and everyone else's judgment, "By a Comanche's knife." The coroner's pen touched paper and made the beginning of an S. Agnes Wainwright set her hand down with the old speed she had when a widow fainted at a wake and would have cracked her head on the parlor stove. She pressed the blotter to the page before the letter was a letter. Ink bled and made a small black cloud. She lifted her thumb off, leaving a print in red where a cut had reopened, opening a crate that morning. The blot sat there like a wound that had decided to speak. "By whose hand?" the coroner asked again, without looking up. The captain said, "By lawful defense in the act of stopping a murderer hired to kill a witness." The coroner's mouth made a line that could have been agreement or gas. He wrote, "By a man acting in lawful defense during arrest." He did not write a name. He looked up at Silas like a man judging a cut of meat gone off. The board coughed and coughed again and pretended it had chosen this phrasing on its own. Silas went very still, the way snakes do when you step too close. The bandage on his hand had soaked through. The red showed like a flower and kept growing. He tested his irons at the wrist once. Eyes on honor, eyes on the clay-stained place that rain had cleaned. He smiled toward Marjorie and put pity in it, like poison. He watched the captain watching him and filed the angle of that gaze away. Men like Silas live on angles. The hearing moved like wagons through mud, slow, with a lot of noise. They signed the priest's sworn statement and stuck it under a paperweight made of glass and a dead scorpion. They copied Agnes's ledger line, the words, "cash only," marching across the page like soldiers who didn't ask questions. Marjorie's confession went into an envelope with sand shaken in to dry the ink. Honor spoke last, simple as bread, and the room listened because you have to, when a voice does not ask to be believed, only to be heard. When the board finally had the sense to be done, the captain said, "My prisoner will be lodged. The women will be given rooms where the roof does not leak. The priest will say whatever he must say to whatever God is awake. The coroner will do his duty over that man we left on the bluff. In the morning, papers travel." He made it all sound settled. Men breathed like they had been held down, and the hand had moved off. That night the fort slept with one eye open. The last of the storm dragged its nails down the walls. Outside the stockade, a little clot of men who liked calls to action that involved other men's blood gathered under the lee of the sutler's shed. They had a key someone shouldn't have had. They had a bottle they shouldn't have finished. They had a plan that made sense to drunk men whose mamas had called them brave. They would take Silas out and call it justice. They would string Sate up on the flagpole and call it a lesson. They would haul honor by the hair and call it order. They moved like men trying to be quiet, who have never had to be. Pahi heard them the way a fox hears things that might be food and might be trap. He slid off the rafters over the gate and whispered to Sate through the square of the window, like wind under a door. Sate said nothing. He put his palm to the clay line and found it gone, washed clean. He looked up at the sky for a sign and got only a ragged piece of cloud that looked like a cut buffalo hide. He made his own sign. He woke the captain by doing nothing but being there. Sometimes a presence is alarm enough. The captain came out with his coat half on and a pistol that had seen 4 campaigns and said 2 words, "Not here." They let the men put the key to the lock. They let them open the door enough to stick an arm through. Then they put the door back with their arms still in it. The sergeant leaned into the wood until some bones thought about giving up. "That's the law shaking your hand," he said without needing to raise his voice. "And you can keep the shake or you can pull away." And I dragged the arm off. They kept the shake because their courage drained out with the blood from the knuckles. The captain opened the door and took their names, the way a teacher takes a list of boys caught with frog strings in their desk. He said, "You will report here clean in the morning, and you will stand in that yard, and you will hear words. If you do not, we will come to where you sleep, and we will speak to your wives, right there, above your boots. Shame is a better leash than rope." They would come. Far toward morning, Sheriff Ellison let go. He had gripped the edge of the bed and the world both. He let go of the first and the second followed. He didn't fight, because the thing he had needed to do had been done. He had moved his body where a bullet meant for a woman would find him first. He had said what he had to say and been forgiven more than he deserved and less than he wished. His last exhale made a small white thread in cold air and was gone. Padre Valdez closed the man's eyes like he was closing a book whose story you didn't love until the last chapter. Agnes made one small notation on a card. Hour. Witness. Last words. She kept her face steady and her throat tight and would cry later over a kettle where no one could see. Honor washed her hands at a basin and let the water run until it went from pink to clear. She did not look at the blood in the bowl like it meant fate. It meant work. The inquest the coroner held at first light was short because some deaths explain themselves and some never will, even if you talk for days. He wrote Tom Ellison in a hand that could be read at a distance. Under cause, he wrote the thing the captain said, died in the performance of duty. Under circumstances, he started a line that would have made a story long enough to fill the rest of the book about how a sheriff falls on a bullet, meant for a woman he failed first and tried to pay later. He did not blot that one. He let it sit and blacken. Word the fort sent out snaked faster than any rider. By noon, the yard held half the town, and the part that was missing had sent cousins. Men in their Sunday coats and men in shirts with sleeves that had never seen a cuff stood shoulder to shoulder. Women stood near the back with baskets, and the hard calm that says, "They have fed worse crowds for less reason." The preacher came to stand with his Bible and keep score. The captain set a makeshift platform with 3 boards and a barrel and walked up with his hat in his hand and said what he had to say, that a man with money had used law like rawhide to pull a woman where he wanted, that other men had helped because fear is cheap and pays on time, that one man died because he remembered too late the job he'd meant to do all along, that this Comanche here had done the decency that the law had pretended to and would be treated with the same decency in return. "You will see chains," he said, and the crowd leaned. "They will be on the right wrists." They brought Silas Rook out. He came quick-eyed, assessing. Some men, when ruined, look small. Silas looked dangerous. He scanned the crowd like a market where you can still get a bargain. He found Marjorie and sent a look like a knife. He found Honor and tried a smile that had once charmed an entire Thanksgiving table. It slid off her. She had brought the altered brand iron in a sack over her shoulder. She held it like a farmer holds a bad root he has dug up and means to show. Padre Valdez climbed the boards and opened the register and laid it in the center like an oath stone. Agnes put her ledger beside it. The coroner stood with his book. The captain gestured to Marjorie, and she mounted with knees that knocked but did not buckle, and told the room the tack room hiding, and the filed spur, and the promises and the lie. She did not cry until the end. Then she cried, and could keep talking anyway, a new skill she had earned this week. The priest showed the cut page to the town because sometimes you have to show a wound so it can scar. He said, I did this. If there is blame here, take it to me. If there is gratitude, send it to God. Silas shifted his weight. The irons caught and clicked. He turned his head to the side where two of his loyal hands had pushed through the crowd. He lifted his chin 1 degree. That was the signal they had always watched for. The little nod men who don't sweat, use when they mean to kill, and get home in time for supper. The two hands slid sideways through the crush. The captain didn't see. He was watching the priest's book. The sergeant didn't see. He was counting hats. Sate saw, because he had been watching one place on the fence since dawn. He moved like light off a knife, not at the gun hands, but between them, and the small motion forced both to check their lines. Their shots went off stupid into the air, splintered a board, broke the preacher's Bible strap. Pahi's rifle spoke once, and then again, clean and mean. 2 wrists ruined, 2 pistols dropped. No one died because Sate had decided no one should. Deciding is a power, if you've earned it. Panic wanted the day. The day told Panic to wait. The captain lifted both hands and made stillness with his body. He turned to Silas and said, in a voice that was almost kind, because men with ruin in front of them are still men, "Is there anything clean left in you want to say?" Silas held the moment like a coin and decided he could still purchase pride. He took a breath and made a speech that would have worked on a jury with a fondness for expensive boots. He talked about civilization and women who needed a hard kindness. He talked about property and paper. He changed the direction of words with small turns, like a man turning a calf into a chute. He had not read the weather. The crowd had. They did not buy. It is a strange mercy when a whole town grows up at once. The captain turned to Honor. "And you?" he asked. She said, "I'll keep mine short." She took the brand iron from the sack and set it on the boards with the filed face up, where everyone could see the sickness in the metal. She set the broken file down beside it, and the tally from the trading post, and the warrant and the undertaker's ledger copy. And then she did the simplest, bravest thing she could do. She turned her wrists up to the crowd. The scars had already started to pale at the edges, a little ragged rope under skin. She did not flinch. "You called me too fierce to love," she said, looking at no one and everyone. "I kept saying no to a lie because no is what you say to refuse a chain. If that is fierceness, keep calling me it. Say it until your mouths learn the taste of truth. There is nothing left here for sale." She dropped the brand iron into the sack, and the clank was the sound of a door closing. When the moment was ripe, men felt it in their chests. The captain nodded to the sergeant and to the 2 troopers on Silas's elbows. They turned him to the guardhouse. They would take him to the fort prison at Jacksboro after papers were stamped and signatures pinned, and a panel of men who had never missed a meal would decide a sentence as if they had invented consequences. He tried one last wrench and found Sate there, not touching him, simply present, the way a cliff is present when you stand at the edge and think about jumping. Silas stopped thinking about it. By the time the sun slid behind a line of cloud and made light like a blade laid flat, the yard had emptied down to the people who had work later. The captain, with his mounds of paper. The priest with his cut page that would keep him up nights. Agnes with a ledger that weighed the same and felt heavier. Marjorie sitting on a step because her legs had remembered they were tired. Pahi picking splinters out of the preacher's Bible strap, just to put his hands to something. Honor stood alone at the rail in the little mission chapel. The scar where the name had been cut looked white as bone. Candle wax puddled and held the shape of its slow fall. Sate came to the doorway, not crossing, not yet. He put his palm to the jamb, a respectful man making note of another's God's threshold. He watched her without staring. He saw how still she had gone now that there was no need to hold still for anyone else. He saw the way her mouth softened when she let herself breathe. He felt the clay line on his palm, gone to a memory the rain had finished. He said, "The debt is balanced." The way he said it made it into a thing with the solidness of a stone in the hand. He lifted his knife and cut the air between them with a motion like slicing a cord, not threatening, freeing. "You are unbound." He stepped back like a man does when he gives back a thing he could have kept and chooses not to. Honor stepped forward to the rail, and set the brand iron there, and the broken file, and left both lying like old skins. She turned and walked the length of the aisle to the door. She stopped on the sill. It is hard to cross thresholds you have used for different reasons. She lifted her palm. There was no clay on it. She set it to his, skin to skin, not as the mark of a debt, but as the beginning of a different kind of line, one no book could cut, and no man could buy. He did not suppose that palm meant belonging. He did not suppose it meant nothing. He took it for what it was, promise without ownership. He let go first, so the leaving would be hers. Agnes Wainwright, later that night at her little table with a strip of lamplight and the sound of rain still talking in the eaves, opened her ledger and added one last, private line at the very bottom, where only God and undertakers ever look. Chains returned. None. She shut the book and put her hand on it, and felt it beating a little under her palm, as if paper had found a pulse. She sat like that, until the oil went out. Silas Rook went to trial, in a room that smelled of wood and old decisions. The board and a judge with a throat like a bullfrog's gullet listened to men say things, and to papers lie, or tell truth, depending who held them. Silas's money made its last bids, and found fewer takers. Marjorie stood up twice and said the same hard thing both times. The priest stood and let men call him names there are rules against using in church. The captain stood and told the truth without adjectives. The verdict came down the way a cut log falls. No poetry, just a thud. They took Silas south in chains, when the heat climbed and the dust rose, and if a man ever said he missed him, he did not say it where women were present. Somewhere along the road, a trooper who had grown up poor and mean let the shackles bite when the mule stumbled, because he thought of his mother's wrists when the landlord came. Men keep their own small ledgers, even good men. Weeks later, time enough for bruises to yellow, and for children to learn a new song mocking a man who had once seemed tall. The hospital at Fort Richardson sealed a file their clerk had meant to finish, and hadn't. It held a photograph of a pair of wrists, healed smooth and pale, where iron had burned them raw. The negative sleeve bore 2 penciled letters, HQ. No caption, no date, just proof that the body remembers, and then decides how to show it. The file got mislaid in a EI drawer that stuck, the way truths do when no one needs them for a little while, and then someday needs them very much. Honor walked the road out of the fort with a small bundle under her arm, and a looser step than the one she had walked in with. She left behind a grave with a wooden board that said Tom Ellison, and a little cross the priest had carved with a penknife that had cut better things than paper. She left behind a town, still deciding what to call courage when a woman held it. She left behind a shelf with a ledger and a register and a coroner's book, each with a mark in it that would force a story to turn out different if anybody later tried to twist it into comfort. She went toward a sky that had learned mercy for a week and might forget it in a day, and would have to be reminded again. At the edge of the llano, where grass takes better purchase, and the ground gives up pretending to be the devil's anvil, Sate sat his horse on a small rise. He did not wave, because waving is a town gesture. He touched his palm and let it rest on his thigh, and that was enough. Pahi cantered up, grinning, one arm bandaged and used too much, and offered Honor a canteen he had filled at a creek he liked because the minnows in it were bold. She drank, handed it back, and said, "I will not be anyone's chain." Pahi laughed with all his teeth. "Only your own," he said. "That is a good heavy thing." He kicked his horse and lit out. Sate watched her a long moment more, as one would watch a hawk climbing a thermal, pleased with the sight, companion to it, not master. Then he turned his horse toward the red bluffs, not away, and not toward her, alongside, like a horizon. The wind came and lifted the hair at the back of her neck, and cooled the old burns, and found the scar on her cheek, and played there as wind does, with ridges and scars and seed. The land in front of her did not promise gentleness. It promised exactly what it always had: heat and flood, quick snakes and slow men, dust and rain and work. She set her step into it, and let words fall away in her mind, until she reached a clear, simple sentence she could carry forever. "I belong to myself." The vultures circled, as they do, The hawk cut his slow, bright arcs. Far off a bell spoke because a priest was ringing it for morning, or because the rope had finally worn through and fallen. Nobody could tell. This tale survives in scraps because most tales worth the keeping do. The sheriff's deposition holds a line scratched out where a man's pride tried to stand back up and was pressed flat. The undertaker's ledger carries a thumbprint in red where a name would have been written to satisfy a bully, and instead, a woman's hand said no. The mission register bears a clean white mouth in the page where a priest's penknife took a man's claim out by the root, and in a sealed hospital file at Fort Richardson, there lies a photograph of wrist scar, healed and smooth as river stones, labeled simply HQ. No one bothered to add the last line it proved. Agnes did, in her own book, and it is the line that matters. Chains return, none.